Many of you think I lived this fairy tale life, married to the Senate President, mother of 3 wonderful children, and a physician. And life is good now, but I didn't always live a fairy tale life. I was a victim of domestic violence for 7 years in a previous marriage, and frankly, very lucky to be alive and to be here. I'm one of the lucky ones. I was physically, verbally, and emotionally abused and stripped of my self-esteem, which is typical in that cycle of abuse. I would file the restraining orders and have arrests done and flee for my life. But eventually I would forgive him because I always had that hope that he would get better. And as a physician, I wanted to fix a bird with a broken wing. I wanted to help him. That's what I do, after all, for a living, is try to fix people. But finally, I realized that I couldn't help him and that it wasn't my fault anymore. And that took a lot to get to that point. But I'm an example of how it could affect anybody of any educational level or of any socioeconomic status. And breaking the cycle of abuse was the hardest task I've ever done in my life. It wasn't getting into med school, it was breaking the cycle of abuse. But finally, after many years of school, I finally had the financial independence to give me that courage to leave. And I know that that's the main hurdle that most women have, is the fear of the financial insecurity for themselves and for their children. And I know that that is what prevents them from leaving and keeps them into that cycle of abuse. I used to be very ashamed of my past, and for many years hoped no one would find out. But now, God has blessed me with the most amazing husband, someone I once knew in college, but later on in life we were reacquainted shortly after my divorce. A stable, loving man who's the polar opposite of my abuser, a man who swept me off my feet and is now my knight in shining armor, and I love you, honey. Thank you. After much prayer and reflection, I decided to come forward with my past, to help others. Many events came together to gave me the sign that it was the right thing to do, and it was the right time. And I had my husband's support and his blessing, and he said, honey, if it's gonna help others, tell your story. And that's the kind of guy he is. Our local newspaper this past November wanted to do a profile piece on me. And when I was discussing this with the reporter about the chronological history of my life, I said, do I tell her everything? And I felt it was the right thing to do. And I'm so glad I did. For shortly after my story went into the newspaper, I received a phone call from Tiffany Carr, the head of the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence, with this long-winded, wonderful voicemail in her southern accent. And I thought, who is this lady? But she said that after my story hit the newspaper, that the hotline received a surge, and hundreds of women called referring to my article to get help. And I knew then it was the right thing to do. I was so nervous about the response of what people would think once I came forward, but it was overwhelmingly positive, and patients and friends and neighbors and strangers would come up to me and say, I read your story, and then they would start telling me their story. And it was just wonderful to strip down that barrier so people can talk about it. When I was going through part of this journey in life, I would reflect and ask God, why am I going through what I'm going through? What life lesson am I learning? It made me a stronger, more empathetic person, especially for my patients. But once I received Tiffany's phone call, I knew that I was fulfilling my destiny. I knew that my past and coming forward with it to help others was what I was meant to do. I want to help strip the stigma and the stereotypes and the barriers that exist that prevent people from getting help. And I take great responsibility in my survivorship. A pastor recently told me at an event that I was a keynote speaker at for a fundraiser in Vero for a domestic violence safe space, and he said, God doesn't waste any hurt. And it's true. And I know a lot of people here today are helping others because of the hurt that they've had in their past or their family members. And that's why they help others. And it's true, God doesn't waste any hurt. I have found catharsis in advocating to help victims stay safe and heal. Not only domestic violence victims, but sexual abuse victims. And now with the innocent victims of the pill mill epidemic, and I'm so happy to be a part of the task force for the neonatal abstinence syndrome. Since I came forward with my past, I pledged to make a statewide difference fighting against domestic violence. And I'm happy to report, due to the leadership of my husband and Tiffany Carr and the governor, that great advancements have been made in the plight against domestic violence. Like I said earlier, it's been a decade since there's been an increase in funding for the 42 domestic violence centers. The operating cost increased, get this, guys, by $1 million recurring every year because of their leadership, and I believe that deserves a round of applause. So it's gone from $21 to $22 million annually recurring for the 42 domestic violence shelters. And of course, in a budget shortfall of $2 billion, that was no easy task. But I believe the need was there. You see, even though violent crime statistics have gone down, domestic violence incidence has gone up. And I know there's many factors that contribute to that. But it says a lot about Governor Rick Scott and the legislature for helping those that are most vulnerable in our state. 40% of the homicides here in this state are related to domestic violence. Therefore, I believe without a doubt the increase in funding was warranted, and they proved their need. With this money, centers will be able to meet the needs of more women through their outreach programs and hopefully be able to house more women and children in their shelters. In addition to this vital funding, 3 pieces of legislation passed, very key, and by the way, unanimously passed through the House and Senate. The first was on stalking. It reinforces the laws with stalking and increases the penalty on stalking and cyber stalkers. And stalking is one of the precursors, or the biggest precursor to domestic violence homicide. So this was very important. The second piece of legislation also protects the identity of the victims through the courts, the clerk of courts. And this happens through a number of measures, but allows the personal information to be exempt from public records for 5 years. And the last piece of legislation streamlined the process of the administration of domestic violence, and therefore shrinks government. And it takes $1 million out of administration and puts it into the services for victims where it belongs. That's very important. And lastly, the state is pursuing 3 circuit courts in which they're starting a GPS monitoring system that the judges will be able to point the perpetrator to where these who have had a restraining order. So I'm eager to see how these pilot projects pan out, and hopefully this could be a statewide program that gets initiated eventually. But all these measures aim to strengthen our state's fight against domestic violence and put an end to the cycle of abuse. And while these accomplishments are significant, we must be vigilant on all fronts that fight domestic violence, be it through law enforcement, in the courtroom, prevention programs, and through education. With statistics citing 1 in 3 women in their lifetime, again, I'm going to say this statistic because it's quite important, will be a victim of domestic violence. There's much work to be done. And I pray that my story sheds light in the darkness of all victims out there, to give them hope and courage. Today we mourn victims that we have lost, celebrate the survivors, and unite and recognize those who have selflessly given themselves to help others. Congratulations to the recipients of the awards today for going above and beyond their call of duty to help our communities be a safer, better place to live. Thank you.